Chapter 4 of Sinister House by Leland Hall. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Chapter 4. All this happened early in September. The weather had been uncertain from the middle of August, and the day after Eric came home was furious with rain and wind. We hadn't a very cheerful breakfast, Annette and I and the children. Felicia had had nightmares too, and had let the eggs burn. But I remember saying to my wife when I got home that night, very wet and tired, that it was sure to blow and rain itself out at last in time for my vacation, which I always took in the fall and which was due to begin the next week. And that's just what happened. After the 14th or 15th of September, we had a 3-week spell of the loveliest weather you can imagine. I always have been lucky on my vacation. But it wasn't the spell of weather, but the visit of Giles to our house, and what he brought with him, or stirred up, that have made that epoch a vivid memory to me, one which has stayed just behind my everyday sense for nearly 4 years. At the time, none of that was so real to me as my enjoyment of the mild fall days, sowing the lawn, setting out bulbs, Annette and I, crocuses, daffodils, squills, she can tell you what they were, though I think it was Giles that set us to doing it, tinkering with the Ford and polishing it, days of golf and picnics with the children up the river. It may be temperamental with me, and the word makes me laugh, but I've always found joy just as real as sorrow, more real indeed. Everything bad that comes to me seems like an unpleasant dream, from which I'm always looking to wake up, whereas when I'm having a good time, I don't want to go to bed at all. Half our sorrows come from an overbalanced mind, and the other half are aggravated by too much thinking on oneself. I went on having a sensible, happy time, while two persons whom I knew intimately were being stretched tighter and tighter on a rack. And not until I was caught in the infernal thing myself had I the slightest suspicion of what was going on. Of course, I heard the gossip, but I didn't heed it, and in our nightly councils I scolded Annette for listening to it and favoring it. As a matter of fact, she countenanced no more of it than appeased her pique at Julia. That was very slight, after all, and pardonable. If you confess with proper humility that you don't see something, and the one to whom you confess it replies with, "No, I suppose not," in a tone you take to mean, "Poor thing, you ought to see it, but you haven't sense enough," or "You aren't refined enough," or "You aren't made of the right stuff," well, it puts you on the lookout for the beam in the other fellow's eye, no matter how much you may admire him. The trouble was, we both see now that Annette misunderstood Julia's meaning entirely. The little remark, if it was anything but a blind, rang with envy rather than with contempt. I used to laugh to see Annette trying to pump her cousin for the latest dope on the arts. All of Annette's family except Giles were good, sensible people like herself, and Giles always remained a freak to them, someone for whom an apology, or at least an explanation, was necessary. I dare say no one of them, save my wife, ever thought to profit by his abilities and take a little schooling at his hands, but she used in those days to ask him questions as if she were humoring him, and entirely nonchalantly, and she quite fooled me. Not until I began to hear queer words of his lingo, such as composition, values, chiaroscura, fall from her own serene lips, did I realize what she was up to. And he must have known it too, and if he gave out anything at all to her, it must have been with utmost carelessness. He didn't care a snap of his finger about our sense of beauty. He knew us for just what we were, pitied us for that, liked us for that, and once confessed to me, envied us for that. Which last I take to mean that no one would be an artist if he could help it. But I must say Giles is a fine fellow, and a gentleman. He has since died, fighting for France, which he was the first to make me understand would be fighting for the soul of the world. As for the gossip, I had rather pass over it. But since I am going to plunge into the heart of the affair, and must, perforce, confine myself to what either Annette or I actually saw or experienced, I'd better tell you some of the many yarns, so that you will have an idea of how the strange drama impressed the circle of Forsby's best. So far as I can remember, up to the time of Giles' long stay with us, the only thing Forsby had against Eric and Julia, and gossip, you know, is always what you have against the other fellow, was the fact that they live in that gloomy old house. Julia was exceedingly charming. Eric was by contrast reserved. I have already told you that the house was uncanny to most of us. Added to their choice of such a dwelling, their dress, their independent manners, and their way of speech were enough to brand them as different. To be different is, I have observed, invariably blameworthy. And in this case, Eric, naturally, was held to blame. There was something queer about him. I mean, that was the gossip. It never got going very strong. To tell the truth, I think most of us stood a little in awe of him. But during the 6 weeks that followed his dramatic homecoming, it so happened that he was now at home, now off on another trip. And Forsby noticed not only that in the periods of his being at home, Julia was pale and depressed and didn't appear often on the links of the Caraway Club in Stanton, but that when he was away, she brightened up in appearance and manners and played golf almost every day. Well, Giles was with her a very great deal during the days and sometimes weeks that Eric was away. They used to play golf together and to take long walks together, and he was almost every afternoon at her house for tea, whether Eric was at home or not. It wasn't surprising that the ladies began to whisper among themselves, nor was it surprising that they came to the decision that Giles was in love with Julia, that Julia glad of Giles' company, that everything wasn't peaches and cream in the Greer household. But let it go. The saddest part of it was that Eric at one time probably heard some of it. He was so sensitive that it didn't take much of a hint to make him worry. Yet, as I've already told you, he could never have doubted Julia's love for him. Now to go back to my story. It must have been a Friday night that Eric came home so unexpectedly from his first trip away. Though he told me that he had only 36 hours to pass at home with his wife, he did not leave until Monday morning. This I remember because early Monday morning I telephoned Julia I was going down to the train station from New York to meet Giles, from whom we had received a telegram the night before. I wanted to see Julia, and I thought that perhaps I might give her a lift along the road somewhere, or take some letter down to the station for her. Besides, the Ford was working wonderfully well that morning. You understand, we had seen nothing of Eric or Julia since that Friday night. They were at that time so wrapped up in each other that we should not have thought of breaking in on them. To my surprise, Eric answered the telephone, and it was he who was glad of a chance to be taken to the station. There was a train down to New York just before Giles's train up from there was due. Eric was leaving on that, so I hustled over for him in the Ford. It was a wonderful morning. The shadows under the hemlocks by Eric's house were the only dark things I saw, and I always felt rather than saw them. Eric was waiting for me on the steps to the front door, with his bags at his feet. Julia was standing beside him, heavily veiled. "Will you be good enough to take me along, too?" she asked, in an unusually low voice. "I want to go with Eric as far as I can." "And," Eric added with great tenderness, "I want her to have a lot of this sweet, fresh air." "Then for heaven's sake, take off that thick veil, Julia," I cried. "It's a gorgeous day. Don't shut it out. There's no dust. The roads are still wet." "Do, my dear," Eric urged. "No one will see that mark. All the black and blue spots in the world wouldn't make any difference to me or to anyone." She stood beside him. I was going to say trembling. I never saw Julia tremble while she had strength enough to stand on her feet, but there was something about her that morning suggestive of extreme weakness, and I had a feeling of uncertainty about her health. "Have you had a fall, Julia?" I asked anxiously. "The silly girl walked in her sleep last night," Eric explained, "and bumped her cheek." In the way of a joke, I shouted, "Oh, you Lady Macbeth!" I had a moment's pride of my knowledge of Shakespeare. But Julia put her hand up in protest. "Don't say that," she cried. "I've done nothing I can think of." I could see that I had upset her. "All right, Julia," I said. "I'll take your word for it. Only, please take off that funeral crepe and enjoy the morning sunshine. There's nothing better than cool, fresh air for the black and blue spots." That was a fatuous remark, but it pleased Eric. We could not persuade Julia to lift her veil, however. In her simple gray frock she looked like a girl but for the wretched black drapery about her head, a device which, in my eyes, always gives women the appearance of victims going to the block to have their heads cut off. Not one word did either of them say to or for me as I drove them through Flat Forsby to the station that morning, but I heard their low, affectionate voices all the way. That was a pleasant sound, and together with the golden September weather, the early morning sun and the clean-washed air, drove from my mind the thought it had harbored for a moment that this Julia was not the merry Julia of our little Friday night dinner. I remember a shock at the station, however. They were greatly upset at parting, much as they controlled themselves, and I left them standing on the platform and stepped to my car just alongside. As the train came in, she threw up her veil to take his kiss, and then I caught a glimpse of her face. Anguish at parting might have taken the blood from her cheeks, but when, after the train had pulled out of the station, she came towards me, her veil still lifted, I saw she was haggard as well as pale. Tears were in her eyes. Just a step or two, she appeared uncertain in her movement, and then she set her lips and came forward staunchly. She ignored the hand I offered to help her into the car, and without even looking at me, stepped in and took her seat calmly. I saw the mark, high on the right cheekbone, the discoloration spreading up under the outer corner of the eye. She had forgotten about her veils being lifted. Indeed, I now know that she wore it to hide her face from Eric only. Up to the final scene, it remained her greatest care to conceal from Eric, as far as she could, the signs of her suffering, the nature of which she had determined he must not know. After a while she blew her nose a little, coughed, and then turned her moist gray eyes to meet my too anxious look. "How foolish I am to love him so," she said, smiling a little. In the few minutes we had to wait for Giles's train, we said nothing. She was completing the mastery over herself. From time to time I stole a glance at her sweet, determined little face. After her tears had ceased to flow, she sat quietly with her hands folded in her lap and devoted herself more and more to her own thoughts, no detail of which was recorded on the sensitive white mask of her face. Under her breast and throat I saw waves of emotion rise and fall, but her firm lips were locked against the force of them. It was a relief to hear Giles's train come rumbling into the station. We were waiting on the inbound side. After the train had pulled out, I saw Giles on the other platform across the tracks. He had a couple of heavy bags at his feet, and he was looking irascibly up and down and all around, shouting, "Porter!" at men on our side of the rails, pointing his cane at them, behaving as he usually behaves, as if the whole world were reprehensibly indifferent to him, and he wouldn't put up with it much longer. What I really envied in Giles was not his ability as an artist, or his money, or his swagger English clothes, but his contemptuous indifference to making a scene. The 2 or 3 huskies on our side of the station merely gave him the once-over and went on about their business. Oh, my beloved America, have we not much to learn about the treatment of artists? But believe me, I was tickled just the same. Of course, it was up to me to go get his bags. He could not be expected to carry them himself. So I ran down through the tunnel under the tracks up to Cousin Giles, took his bags, heavy brutes, one in each hand, and started back again. And he followed me, roaring all the way about this damn deserted place. I knew I could have asked him what the blank he came for, but it was never any satisfaction to come back at Giles. Might as well ask Old Faithful what he spouts for, or Vesuvius why she smokes. He was a sort of short, thick-set volcano himself. He had a full face, not exactly sallow, but brownish, with rather protruding yellow-brown eyes, tremendously animated, a ludicrously small nose and nervous full lips, not a bit concealed by his scant mustache, which was yellowish also. The line of his jaw and chin was overlaid with flesh and muscle, and he had the neck of a bull, though he wasn't what you'd call a beefy man. He was, I know, tremendously intelligent, intolerant, impatient, and more nervous than any lean man I've ever known. He was so full of energy that I often wondered if he ever slept at all. Funny what things come back to me. I do remember one night I heard him snoring when there was a horror stalking through the house. To many of us he seemed all-fired important, and that's what he was, I now believe, to his country and to the world. As we approached the Ford that morning and he saw that there was a woman in it, he all but balked. Probably he had had no sleep the night before, for he had come from somewhere down in Maine, and the thought of having to ride so early in the morning with a commonplace woman gave his nerves another twist of the screw. But I said, "Come on now, Giles, you've got to be civil on such a fine morning. Besides, it's Mrs. Greer." "Greer? Greer?" he roared, making me hot all over. "I don't know any Greers. Why the devil should I be civil to Mrs. Greer?" "Because," I answered in a low but angry voice, "she's a damn fine woman, whether you know her or not, and she isn't very well." "Huh, so you're going to give me a sick one on this fine morning, are you? Damned if I won't walk." We didn't often damn ourselves and each other so freely, and I was mortified at the thought that Julia might have heard. By the way, I have never heard Eric use an oath of any kind. But Julia was probably too much absorbed in her own thoughts to hear us. She started when I spoke to her. "Julia," I said as cheerfully as I could, "this is my cousin, Mr. Giles Farrow. He has just told me that he is going to walk to the house. We shan't have the pleasure of his company." He raked off his hat in a boorish sort of way. His lank hair never seemed combed, and stooped to lift his dress suit case. But at the sound of her voice, like a sweet silver bell always, with something courteous in the inflection, he stood up quickly, gave her a keen, critical, almost arrogant look, and then plumped himself down beside her in the back seat. I don't know what it was always made Giles seem bigger than the place he was in. Mopping his forehead and blowing a bit, he was like a steam engine in the back seat of my Ford. While I was laboring to lift his heavy bags to the front seat, and while I made sure that the doors were all fast and did the many little things one does so proudly about a Ford, I saw him dart swift glances at Julia's face. She rather turned away from him, which I should judge was not what he was used to having women do, and we rode on in silence for a good while. All of a sudden he asked her if she lived in one of the new concrete stables they were putting up out here. She laughed and told him that she lived in the one old house that had been left standing.
"I knew it," he roared. "You've got some sense. I've seen you before, too. I stumbled on that old place when I was here in June. Saw you and your husband setting out flowers. Foxgloves, n'est-ce pas? How did you happen to hit on that place? Look at all these other insufferable boxes of houses. Look at that one over there, like a county jail. No shade anywhere, either. But I say, you don't look so well as when I saw you before. What's the matter? Been ill?"
"You don't think that old houses are healthy, do you, Giles?" I threw back at him over my shoulder.
"To blazes with health!" he cried incontinently. "Always thinking of your bodies, you Americans!"
If Giles was out of sorts, he always sailed into the Americans, just as if he weren't one himself.
"There's a spirit and a soul to consider. These things you call homes, look at them. Garages, jails, memorial banks. Give me a house that has a spirit in it, like Mrs.
Julia's laugh was a little strained, I thought, but the two of them fell into conversation. They had both lived in Europe and all that sort of thing, so I, who had never been farther across the water than to Staten Island, gave my thoughts to the smoothness of the Ford and the good September sunshine and air. It was Giles who did most of the talking, but now and then Julia asked a question, and once or twice she laughed. At last we reached our home. I got Giles's heavy luggage out onto the granolithic walk. Annette came flying through the front door and down to the car to greet him. My sensible wife was not insensible of the fact that her relationship to Giles gave her something of a standing in the community. This morning, largely for the sake of Julia, I imagine, she greeted him with more enthusiasm than the tie of second cousin usually prompts. Lord, how human that is. But Giles stuck fast in the car. He hardly acknowledged Annette's greeting at all, but tried to continue his conversation with Julia, just as if Annette had not been there beside the car, looking right pretty, too, in the bright sunlight. You see, she has a good skin and pretty hair. Well, it was a little humiliating for Annette. Still, that was no excuse for her taking it out on Julia. Julia was really very sweet to Annette that morning, and thanked her especially for having been good to Eric Friday night. And what did Annette do but say something about having brought a couple of nightmares to the house with him?
"I only said it half jokingly,"
she explained to me later when I took her to task for it.
"You heard me, Pierre. I only said he had brought a couple of nightmares to Bobby and Felicia. How could she have taken it so? She knows that Bobby adores Eric. She knows old Felicia would lie down on the ground for Eric to walk over her. She shouldn't be so sensitive."
At the time I felt that a wrong had been done, and I tried to relieve the situation by reminding Annette that Eric had been good enough to take the nightmares away with him. That didn't improve the situation, but it covered up the silence which had fallen upon Julia's strange, inarticulate distress. Her eyes looked quite horror-struck. I remember thinking, well, women beat the Dutch, and being glad that Annette couldn't see the mark on Julia's other cheek. When women get going, no mere man can tell where they'll end. Giles was determined not to get out of the car, but to go on with Julia and me to the old house. I don't think he cared a hang about seeing it, but he wanted to stay with Julia. How he puffed and roared along the way. In spite of him, however, there were silent spaces. Julia said absolutely nothing and laughed no more. The consciousness that Annette's brusqueness had pained her never left my mind. But I had little idea how nearly Julia was done for. To my utter dismay, she fainted as she stepped out of the car. Luckily Giles, who could be as courteous as a bear, had got round to the door on her side to help her out, and he caught her in his powerful arms as she sank forward. My, he was strong. I think he could have carried Annette, and he carried Julia into the house as if she were a feather. I ran ahead to open the door, fortunately on the latch, and, knowing the house, I piloted him down the narrow hallway, hung with that rosy stuff, into the sitting room, across the floor of which the sunlight, streaming between the rich curtains, lay in bright bars. It touched the pillow on the sofa, just the place for her head to rest. Her hat fell off as Giles laid her down, and the sunbeams glistened in her dark chestnut hair. No need to loosen anything round the slender white throat which rose spotless from the loose blouse she wore. Giles, the thick-set, knelt down beside her and chafed her hands. For him at that moment there was but one person in the world besides himself. He was wholly absorbed in watching her face. But only for a moment or two. He began shouting for someone, anyone, and ordering me not to stand like a blockhead but to fetch water, find the servant, do something. He himself rushed to part the curtains wider, and he nearly tore them down from their rods doing so, and to open the windows and let in more air. Before I left the room I heard Julia say in a low voice, "Keep that thing away from me. Don't let it touch me. Oh, Eric!" How her whisper shook with horror. By the time I returned to the room with a carafe of water and word that the servant would follow me with cologne, Giles had dragged the couch with Julia on it to the west windows, giving upon the veranda and overlooking the river. A cool breeze came up from the water and blew the curls round her pale face, and Giles was standing looking at her, his chin in his hand, his legs far apart, his whole body tense and motionless. "Is she better?" I whispered.
Yes," he growled. "Wet a handkerchief and put it on her forehead, you...
I did so, and Julia opened her eyes. Dazed at first, she asked for Eric, and when I told her that he was gone, she said cryptically, "He must not come back yet. Not yet." I was at a loss to understand this until, as she regained more of her strength, she repeated several times, "He must not see me like this. He must not know." He would indeed have been tortured. At last the old servant came in with the cologne, and Julia held out a hand to me. She spoke a word of thanks to Giles, too, and said to both of us, "It's a feminine absurdity. It means nothing except that... well, nothing. I trust you not to say a word to Eric about it." She closed her eyes. The tears came pushing out slowly from beneath her pallid lids. We knew it was time for us to go. I left the motor running. There's extravagance for you, with gasoline mounting towards the sky. But I didn't care. Giles got up in the front seat beside me, and we started off without a word. At last I said, "That for your old houses. I don't believe that one's healthy. I'll bet it's haunted, too." But Giles never opened his lips, except to put a cigarette between them, which he did not try to light. We must have gone a mile before he shot out at me.
"Her husband?"
"What about him?" I gasped, startled.
"Her husband?"
he roared again. "Look here, Giles," I said, feeling pretty serious. "He's a fine fellow, and she adores him." End of chapter 4.